Hello, good evening. Welcome to all of you on this evening webinar. Our subject today is the 70 years of Chinese colonial rule in Tibet. And the organizers are Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement and the Tibetan Youth Congress. On behalf of these two organizations, I welcome our panelists and our audience. Welcome this evening for joining this show. In the beginning, I will give a introduction to our honored panelists, and then we shift over to the main talks. To start with, I welcome Mr. Kai Mueller. Hello, Kai Mueller. Welcome. Mr. Kai is from Berlin. He is the executive director of the International Campaign for Tibet in Germany since 2005. And as everybody knows, ICT is one of the foremost organizations which is running a campaign in favor of Tibet and advocacy for Tibet among governments and parliaments. So you are welcome here. The ICT, as it coordinates in United Nations the advocacy, and Mr. Mueller has testified before various parliaments, the European Parliament also, and the UN human rights bodies. So he is a jurist and a social scientist by training. He's a political scientist, a public administration expert in public administration. And as we all know, ICT has many feathers to its cap in European Union as well as recently in America. So welcome, Mr. Kai Mueller, to this webinar. We have with us today evening a very prominent expert on Chinese affairs, Mr. Jayadeva Ranade. Welcome, Mr. Jayadeva Ranade. Mr. Ranade is a very famous personality in India, especially in Asia and international forums when it comes to China. He has been additional secretary in the cabinet secretariat of Government of India, and he is presently the president of Center for China Analysis and Strategy. He is a member of the ICWA, the core group of ICWA on China, and he is a distinguished fellow with the Center for Air Power Studies and Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. So Mr. Ranade has an experience of 50 years. He has had many important postings in China and in other countries. He is an expert in Chinese language. He's one of those few experts, China experts in India, who understand how the Chinese system, especially the Communist Party and the governing system functions, how they take decisions. So welcome, Mr. Ranade, to this evening webinar. So, and now we have Sana Hashmi, a very young scholar, an Indian scholar who is today stationed in Taiwan. Sana Hashmi is currently the visiting professor at Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation, and she is a non-resident fellow at Taiwan's Next Gen Foundation. Welcome, Sana, to this show. Sana is the author of China's Approach Towards Territorial Disputes, Lessons and Prospects, which is a very good reference book on how China has handled its border issues with the countries around, about 14 countries. So she has a very good insight of that. And she has been a consultant with the Ministry of External Affairs of India, and she has been associated with Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Chengchi University's Institute of International Relations, the Center for Air Power Studies, South Asia Forum for Human Rights, and Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies, which is a very prominent institute in India. It's a project of Central, and she has been associated with the Central Tibetan Administration also as an advisor. So welcome, Sana, to this evening. Now we have Mr. Tenzin Tsundue. Mr. Tenzin Tsundue is more known than I can explain. He is the most famous and loved faces of Tibetan freedom movement across the world. He has been in the limelight for very courageous reasons and right reasons, and on so many occasions. So he is a poet, he's a writer, he's an activist, and he was born to a Tibetan refugee couple in northern India in the Himalayas, where they were construction workers. So he has 4 books to his credit, and these books are very famous. He was the first winner of Outlook Picador Award for his writings, and his writings have been part of as textbooks in various universities and colleges of India. He not only has encouraged new younger generation of Tibetans in their freedom movement, he has also been a source of inspiration for many films, theater, and music. So welcome Tenzin Tsundue to this show. We have Mr. Gonpo Dhundup. He is the president of Tibetan Youth Congress. Welcome, Gonpo Dhundupji. Tibetan Youth Congress is the best known name among Tibetan diaspora. It is the largest socio-cultural political organization of Tibetan refugee community. And Mr. Gonpo Dhundup has been a very dynamic leader, known for his leadership qualities, social work, much before he became the president of TYC. So he is a very well-known political activist, a social worker. These days, he is very seriously and full-time involved in helping people who need support in COVID-related problems. So he's running around everywhere in Dharamsala and places around to hospitals, etc. So it's a privilege to have you with us. Thank you, Mr. Gonpo Dhundupji. We have Professor Ayushi Ketkar, who is an assistant professor at there is a special center at GNU which is called Special Center for National Security Studies, and she specializes in international relations. And Professor Ketkar has been previously associated with many institutions like Gautam Buddha University in Greater Noida, Amity University, Symbiosis, Bhosala Military College, Nasik, and she has been with think tanks like the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies and the Jammu Kashmir Study Center. So welcome Ayushi to this group. And of course, it's last but not least, our youngest member, Anjali Mishra, who is a budding journalist. Welcome, Anjali, to this group. She has been helping us with our media-related activities, and she is a third-year student of journalism in university, which is in Noida. So welcome, everybody. And now we start today evening's talks. I first request Mr. Kai Mueller to please make your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank VIJAY KRANTI for this kind introduction, and also Tibetan Youth Congress and the Chase Center for Himalayan Asian Studies and Engagement for having me for this very, I think, timely discussion, very appropriate and very relevant discussion. 70 years of Chinese colonialism in Tibet offers certainly a huge amount of issues that would need to be discussed. I would like to share today some general observations from my position, my view as a political advocate for human rights and justice in Tibet in the international arena for the international campaign for Tibet. Colonialism, which is striking from my arena of work, colonialism is not that frequently used in the political and legal discourse on Tibet at this time. Colonialism is not being used to describe the political and social situation in Tibet. Instead, there is a different terminology that's being used. If the mode of governance and the political state of affairs in Tibet is being debated, there is terminology used such as authoritarianism, totalitarianism. Some speak of a police state, a surveillance state, or use simply the words repressive or oppressive. But from my point of view, these descriptions most commonly do not go beyond measuring questions of limitations of state power, or in the case of Tibet, of questions of witnessing the apparent limitless reach of Chinese state power in Tibet. Questions are: what rights are affected, to which degree, of what group of the population? Does the state persecute dissent? Does the state interfere with religious practice? Does it offer the space for any sort of economic activity? Does it respect cultural heritage and practice? Governments, every once in a while, lament the detention of an individual Tibetan. They criticize the CCP's intervention with selecting and appointing Tibetan Buddhist leaders, or they raise cases of torture. Less often, the mode of governance of the CCP in Tibet is considered in statements or declarations. In media reports about Tibet, even to a lesser degree, I would say, the connection is made to the mode of governance. I think this is something that's missing in popular or common understanding of Tibet today. The mode of governance applied by the CCP, plus quite specifically, what is its intention, and perhaps most importantly, what does it do to the objects of its governance, the Tibetans? I think as well, there are some quite specific observations that need to be made that are necessary for any observer to fully understand the situation. I think the concept of colonialism, which we are talking about today, if applied on Tibet, may indeed shed some light on what is going on in the country. Now, I do not want to go into details of theories and doctrines of colonialism. Let's just use this admittedly very simplistic definition. Classic definitions of colonialism view it as a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. There is political and economic control over a dependent territory. Oftentimes there's a population transfer to guarantee rule by loyal individuals, combined with a so-called civilizing mission as a rationale for the colonizers to reconcile the subjugation. I want to recall here a 1997 report published by the Unrepresented Peoples Organization, UNPO, entitled China's Tibet, the world's largest remaining colony. This detailed report, which was a result of an unofficial fact-finding mission to Tibet and Tibetan communities in exile, concludes with some sort of astonishment. It says, I quote, "The PRC, a state which has been at the forefront of the struggle against colonialism and which has been a champion of colonized people, is today undeniably a colonial power itself." And it continues, "China's rule over Tibet since 1951 has all the characteristics of colonialism in the real sense of the word. This is evident not only from the manner in which Chinese authority was established and is maintained in Tibet. It is clear from the way in which the Chinese authorities decide on and implement economic and other development policies and exploit natural resources, and from the population transfer of millions of Chinese into Tibet. It is clear also from the policies implemented by China regarding the Tibetan language, culture, and religion. Mostly revealing is the attitude of the Chinese authorities and of the Tibetan people, whose perceptions of each other are typical of those of the colonial power and the colonized people. End of quote. If we look at Tibet today, we find the observations made in this 1997 report still relevant. And they may even be more pressing than they were back then. I want to look at one distinct such development, which is a project of Sinicization in Tibet. Officially, this term has been introduced with regard to the religions being practiced in the PRC altogether. And it is not exclusively applied to Tibetan Buddhism, but also, as you know, to Christian and Muslim faith. According to official CCP understanding, in a nutshell, Tibetan Buddhism, a cornerstone of Tibetan culture and cultural heritage, is to adapt to the so-called socialist society with Chinese characteristics. This already has far-reaching consequences, as it inevitably will mean the end of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet as a religious practice, if the Chinese authorities succeed. Instead, what will appear as Tibetan Buddhism is actually a belief system that serves the ideological goals of the one-party state. It may look as being religion, but it no longer is. The policies of Sinicization do stretch well beyond this example on religion. They apply to the recent restrictions regarding the use of the Tibetan language, which is apparently to be downgraded to a colloquial means of communication, and a language that is no longer part of cultural development, that cannot describe social innovations, technology, politics, art, or science. Tibetan is replaced by Chinese, the language of the occupying power. Equally worrisome is the drastic intervention of the Chinese state with the livelihoods of Tibetan nomads and herders who have been forcefully settled or relocated in the past decades, since the 1980s. According to media reports and estimates of human rights organizations, up to at least 2 million Tibetans have been subject to these policies. It must be noted that there is no legal redress available for Tibetans affected by these policies. In fact, information or statistics about Tibetans pursuing legal avenues are not available because not one Tibetan has sought them, quite obviously. Given that people have to leave their homes for good, with their lives being upended, with an uncertain future as recipients of government subsidies. And it must be striking that the Chinese authorities do not even attempt to hide these policies from the world. And it must be even more striking that the international community has not raised these policies with disgust and shock. The policies of Sinicization are aimed at reforming the thoughts and minds of Tibetans so that Tibetans actually no longer are Tibetans, not speaking their language, not practicing their beliefs, and not living their lives. I think it needs to be understood that the CCP aims nothing less than reprogramming Tibetans' minds and hearts. The effects of the CCP policies in Tibet need to be discussed and addressed with greater urgency. The international community should not look at individual or single developments alone, but look at the big picture. There needs to be an understanding of the DNA of CCP rule in Tibet, its intentions, and foremost, what are the consequences for the Tibetan people. And I think from my very personal view, this should also entail a revisiting of the concept of cultural genocide. Colonialism, in a strict sense, requires one people subjugating the other. In the case of Tibet, in fact, from our point of view, from my point of view, one may come to the conclusion, given the policies of thought and behavioral reform as described before, one may come to the conclusion that Tibetans as a distinct people are to disappear altogether. Tibet without Tibetans. Against this background, the international community needs to realize and address the Sino-Tibetan conflict, as said, with greater urgency and on a different political level. Part of this should be a rebuttal and countering of the CCP's narrative with regard to its policies in Tibet. It will be crucial to point out the colonialist nature of the CCP's governance and to point out the openly discriminatory and thinly veiled racist view on Tibetans, which are integral parts of these policies. I'm looking forward to hearing the other presentations today of the participants of this webinar and would like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Kai, for a very precise insight into what is happening in Tibet. Tibet is today facing the danger of becoming a Tibet without Tibetans, or with the minds and hearts of people reprogrammed according to the communist ways of ruling a colony. Thank you very much. This is quite an eye-opener for all of us. And now I will request Mr. Jayadeva Ranade to please educate us on different aspects of what kind of colonialism activities are there, and how what are China's intentions and their style of functioning and their future plans. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. VIJAY KRANTI. Namaskar, good evening, and Tashidalek. At the outset, let me just say that with such a distinguished audience, there's no question of my educating anyone, but I would like to put across a few points that might add to the discussions. Firstly, today, of course, is the day which marks the 70th anniversary of China's occupation of Tibet, which is the theme of our webinar. And the Chinese also have taken note of it and come out with the white paper, which they released on the 21st. In other words, to coincide with this 70th anniversary. And the interesting part is that this white paper spends a considerable portion of time in terms of length of the white paper. It's a 41-page white paper with 10 chapters, and most of it is taken up by talking about how the West has been responsible for most of the unrest inside Tibet, and how the various Chinese dynasties have exercised control. They have not used the word sovereignty, but have exercised control over Tibet, and how Tibet was an integral part of China. So obviously, this state of affairs still rankles them. It still bothers them. And let me cite a few instances from the white paper. Firstly, they do say that this idea of Tibetan independence has come about only after the Opium Wars, and that it was the UK-led imperialists, quote unquote, who began to spread this idea. Then they say that the Yuan dynasty, which was there in the 13th and from 1271 to 1368, exercised jurisdiction and governance over Tibet. Its successor, Ming dynasty, began conferring titles like Prince, Prince of Dharma, etc., and also extended its military control all across Tibet, in Wutsang, Chamdo, and Nari. The successor to the Ming dynasty, namely the Qing government, it says, granted the honorific titles of Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama to the 5th Dalai Lama and to the 5th Panchen Lama, and introduced the 29 articles which regulate the reincarnation of lamas. Now, in this process, they have obviously toyed with history and historical facts as is known. But the significant point, as I was trying to make out, is that the Chinese are still insisting that they exercised sovereignty over Tibet, and they still feel it is important for them to keep justifying this or making the point. Later on, it does talk about the various developments that have taken place, the number of railway lines laid down, the roads built, etc. The villages electrified, and no doubt there has been considerable development and progress, but with the twin objectives of ensuring their military presence right along the borders to threaten other countries and also to exploit the mineral resources in Tibet. They have made it a point of referring to the religious personages in Tibet, and we do know from Chinese documents that the Chinese Communist cadres consider the monks and nuns of Tibetan Buddhism as the most troublesome element in Tibet. They have been persuading them to adapt Tibetan Buddhism to socialism with Chinese characteristics. They have been pressurizing them in various ways, and they have even offered them inducements in terms of salaries and pensions and ranks equivalent to the provincial ranks, and also certain other benefits. Obviously, resistance in this regard still continues because the efforts persist. Over the last year and a half, we have been watching that Chinese efforts to, if I may say, subdue the Tibetans in the Tibet regions has intensified. It has taken 2 or 3 forms. The first is to accelerate the pressure for adapting Tibetan Buddhism to socialism with Chinese characteristics. More pressure on the monks and nuns, restrictions on Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns from going outside to other provinces to preach, and posting of party cadres in monasteries to monitor the activities of these religious personages. They've also been insistent that the atheist Chinese Communist regime in Beijing is the sole authority for recognizing living Buddhas, or for that matter, even the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. This facet of their thinking seems to have got accelerated with the passage of time, and they have apparently calculated that they are approaching a time when the question or the issue of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama will come to the fore. This is something that they are fairly worried about and insistent about. They've talked about, including in the white paper, the efforts made to persuade the Dalai Lama to come back, to the contacts that they have made with his special envoys and with him, but have regretted that nothing has happened. As inducement, they also mentioned that the post of vice chairman of the Buddhist Association was kept vacant for him for a number of years. And they have added also that over 600 religious personages today occupy the positions of deputies to people's congresses and to the People's Consultative Conference. So this is the situation there, and it means that the pressure which is being applied on the Tibetan populace, as I said, has been intensified. Coupled with this, there are some more intrusive steps that they have taken, and a couple of them are to place party cadres along, or shall I say, among the Tibetans in the villages. So every village today has a party cadre, and they have paired party members with individual village households. Pairing means that they come and spend time with these people, they live with them, they eat with them, and they have this arrangement whereby, in effect, they are monitoring their daily activities. But let's cut to more recent times, to the 14th five-year plan that was just approved on the 11th of March, I think the decisions taken there and the projects approved there are going to have a very far-reaching impact on Tibet and the Tibetans. As you are aware, the last census which was carried out and the results of which were published last week showed about 13 lakh Tibetans in the TAR. That's a very small number. But the projects approved by the 14th five-year plan or in the 14th five-year plan will envisage or will result in huge numbers of workers coming in from the mainland into Tibet. Let me list a few. 20, as they say, 20 multi-purpose border airports, 2 major rail lines going out of Shigatse to 2 different provinces, the second railway linking the mainland with Lhasa, in other words, the one that comes from Chengdu, new highways which are being built, which will run along the China-India border or the Tibet-India border, and last but not the least, something that will impact almost a crore of people who reside in the Indo-Gangetic belt is the construction of a major hydroelectric power project on the Great Bend of the Brahmaputra River. Whether this is a prelude to diverting the Brahmaputra or not is not yet clear. But certainly, they have plans for 17 dams along the lower reaches of the Brahmaputra. About 7 or 8 of them are either built or under construction. This hydroelectric project is not benign in the sense that if they do carry out a diversion of the river, their compulsion will be to irrigate the fertile lands in northern China, which are dry, they have no water, but the lands are very fertile and arable. Looking at a looming global food shortage around 2035 or so, China will be compelled to push this project. According to the documents that have been seen, there are 2 ways that they plan to do it. One, to build a series of dams and then gradually shift the course of the river northwards. And the second is to carry out a major explosion at the Great Bend and then attempt to shift the course of the river northwards. In either case, a number of people, inhabitants of the lower riparian will be impacted severely. The secondary effect of all this construction work is that the temperatures in Tibet will rise, and according to the Chinese glaciologists themselves, the glaciers are already in retreat. That retreat will be accelerated, resulting in considerably reduced flow of water, if not the drying up of the river systems that come into and feed the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Indus, etc. In other words, we are looking at a fairly stark situation in the future. In addition to all this, Chidala has asked, in fact, I would describe him as one of the fastest rising ethnic Tibetan Chinese communist leaders. He has given a call for Tibetan businessmen to go out to the mainland and start businesses, and a call to mainland businessmen to come into Tibet. This will be happening in addition to the large numbers of workers, technicians, and other personnel who will be coming in to build the railroads, will be coming in to do the road construction, etc. What happens to the demography of Tibet is best left to all your imagination. We can see how it is. Side by side, the other insidious program which has been initiated is that of replacing Tibetan as the primary language of education. It had already been, their efforts to replace it in Tibetan areas had already started, but that was confined to areas outside the Tibet Autonomous Region. As of, I think it was end of last month, they have now introduced this into the Tibet Autonomous Region, whereby Mandarin will replace Tibetan as the primary language. Examinations for government jobs are already being conducted in Mandarin. So the effects are gradual, will be gradual, but they will be, if I may say, quite damaging to the Tibetan culture, to the Tibetan language, and if the Chinese have their way, to Tibetan religion. Let me conclude by just saying that the thrust of Chinese efforts is to ensure that the next Dalai Lama, that is the reincarnation of the 14th Dalai Lama, will be someone whom they have discovered, in quotes, and whom they have educated. The end result is absolutely clear. In fact, Chinwei, a senior faculty member of the Central Party School, has said that under no circumstances should China allow a situation of two Dalai Lamas like it has of the two Panchen Lamas. As we all know, the current Panchen Lama appointed by the Chinese is not yet recognized or accepted by the Chinese people as a Panchen Lama. They do now, after so many years, acknowledge him as a learned monk, but that's it. So with the Dalai Lama, they do not want such a situation to be repeated. Their worry is that as the international environment changes, which it has already begun to, then the reincarnate might also prove to be an obstacle to other Chinese designs. The US support to the Tibetan Buddhists for recognizing the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama and supporting them has already been pronounced. India leaves or doesn't interfere in the religious affairs of the Tibetan Buddhists. So the Chinese will certainly mount pressure on India and other countries to accept their own nominee. The situation ahead is not clear, certainly, but I would suspect that there would be increasing pressure felt by the Tibetan people inside China and by the Tibetan exiles abroad. So in sum, I would suggest that more support is required for various initiatives that they may launch, and the Chinese will, of course, exert their own kind of pressure. So let us see what the future brings, but I certainly don't think that it will be very bleak, because the world situation is changing, with anti-China sentiment globally increasing by the day. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ranade, you have, although you say you had no intention of educating, but the way you have thrown light on how China is functioning, what are its designs, especially their intentions and their explanations of last 70 years through their white paper. That's a very, this is a very timely education, I would say, because it was only 2 days ago that white paper was released, and an explanation about the white paper, its significance, major points are clear, and also what China, what kind of designs it holds on Tibet, and the challenges for countries like India. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And now we will have the privilege of having opinion of a very well-informed scholar, Indian scholar, currently stationed in Taiwan, Dr. Sana Hashmi. Um, as I told already, Sana has a very good understanding of how China operates with its neighbors. And now we are discussing how China has been operating with its colony. So, and she's these days in Taiwan. She has a very good understanding of how China um, deals with its friends, foes, and so Sana, we look forward to you for and I won't say educating, but an informed talk. Thank you, Sana. Please.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Chair, and I'm delighted to be speaking today with the stellar panel today. After Ranade sir, I don't think I could actually cover much ground, but I'll try my best to give an informed opinion on what China is doing in Tibet and how it actually impacts India and other major stakeholders. So recently we saw two important developments with respect to Tibet. It's not that we actually need to have events to talk about Tibet, but these two developments make it all the more important for us to realize how important it is to keep the discourse on Tibet alive and kicking. So the first development is, of course, the appointment of Penpa Tsering as the political leader of the Central Tibetan administration. The election tells us further that the Tibetan movement is deeply rooted in the democratic tradition of holding elections, and there is freedom of voting among the Tibetan community. So this is exactly opposite to what the Chinese government has been doing in Tibet. So I think it's an important development when we talk about the Tibetan movement, Tibetan elsewhere. So this actually kind of defines the Tibetan movement, how the election has been taking place among the Tibetan community. So the second development is the issuing of the white paper on Tibet by China. Ranade sir has brilliantly explained what the white paper actually entails. I'm not going to go into the detail of the white paper, but to just put things into perspective, I'm just going to highlight a few aspects of the white paper. So, as expected, it was mentioned that only China has the right to appoint the next Dalai Lama. So, when we talk about the white paper, which was recently issued, we also have to see the timing. The white paper is there to consolidate China's claim on Tibet for the elections in the CTA. But whatever white paper China has been issuing over the past few decades is primarily to consolidate its effort on Tibet and Xinjiang and all its autonomous regions. So if we look at the words used in the white paper, such as democratic reforms, economic reforms, modernization, all these words actually point out how China has been attempting to justify its activities in Tibet, as has been the case with the previously issued white papers as well. So the white papers are nothing more than the Chinese propaganda. It's actually a chronological account of developments in Tibet, but of course, it's primarily from the Chinese perspective. They really do not take into the perspective of the Tibetans living in Tibet or elsewhere. So the CCP, the Chinese leadership, has tried to justify its claims by saying how Tibet was peacefully liberated and it has been a part of China since time immemorial. So this has been the language China has been using for Tibet since the 1950s. So they claim that the projects in Tibet are a proof that China considers Tibet as its own part and is developing it at the same pace as other parts of China while giving Tibet full autonomy. And in the white paper, it was also mentioned that there is peaceful liberation in Tibet and the introduction of reforms and how Tibet has become a peaceful and a modern place. So this is so far from the truth. Whatever is happening on the ground is so different from what they have mentioned in the white paper. And we scholars and policymakers have been talking about it since decades. There have been numerous incidents of several human rights abuses, environmental degradation, and religious suppression in Tibet by China. And the plight of Tibetan could be actually gauged from the fact that the thousands of Tibetans have fled Tibet and living in other countries, especially India. So instead of addressing these issues, the genuine concerns of the Tibetans, over the past 70 years, the CCP has become more and more aggressive and is leaving no stone unturned to assert that Tibet is an integral part of China and that no interference from other countries will be accepted by the leadership and how Tibet is an internal matter of China. So this further they further claim that the idea of Tibet being free and independent is motivated by the Western imperialist powers who do not want to see a unified China. So this has been repeatedly reiterated in all the white papers which have been issued by the Chinese leadership. But the fact is, no matter what the Chinese say, it's amply clear that the growth and development work carried out in Tibet by the Chinese government is not for the development and prosperity of Tibet and the Tibetans, but for its own selfish motives. So China has been using Tibet as a military base and has exploited its natural resources to sustain its own growth and its increasing demand for natural resources and minerals. And China has slowly and steadily been trying for Hanization of Tibet by its policy of population transfer. This has been discussed several times over the past several decades. Lakhs of Chinese nationals have settled in Tibet, and they have already outnumbered the Tibetan population in Tibet. And this has been China's ploy to eliminate the Tibetan culture and religion. So, in fact, Tibetans have been treated like outsiders in their own country, and this cannot be emphasized enough. And due to this reason, lakhs of Tibetans have taken refuge in other countries, while many more living in Tibet are suffering from injustice and atrocities under the Chinese rule. So one of the major reasons for discontent among the Tibetans in Tibet is that around 90% of the positions in public offices in Tibet are occupied by the Chinese, and the Tibetans are mostly engaged in rural or no-income jobs, and the Tibetans are actually paid lower salaries and wages in comparison to the Chinese who are operating in Tibet. And while Tibet is prospering, I think it's so important to realize that Tibetans are clearly not living a happy or a prosperous life in Tibet. So their major grievance is that they're not allowed to display even a photograph of their religious leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, openly. And in fact, the photographs, we all know this thing that the photographs of Dalai Lama have been replaced by the portraits of Mao Zedong in almost all the monasteries, in all the official public places, and even in the houses of the Tibetans. And also, Ranade sir mentioned about the Chinese government using Mandarin as a medium of instruction at almost all the schools in Tibet. And the more appalling trend is that among all the ethnic nationalities, the literally level among the Tibetans is one of the lowest. And the Chinese government has also boycotted Losar, the Tibetan New Year, and asked the Tibetans not to celebrate it. In fact, we saw what happened in Xinjiang recently. So there were fake propaganda photos of and videos of Uyghurs celebrating Eid in Xinjiang. We don't even see these kinds of propaganda videos coming out from Tibet anymore. So this actually goes on to tell us that how strong and how secure Chinese, the CCP, has become with respect to Tibet and with respect to their control in Tibet. So the Chinese are slowly and steadily endeavoring to wipe out the Tibetan culture and even the Tibetan people from Tibet. And under the Chinese occupation, the fundamental rights of freedom and independence are snatched away, and Tibetans are turned into prisoners in their own country. China refuses to acknowledge that there is a crisis in Tibet, and instead of addressing the grievances of the people in Tibet, which is the need of the hour, China is on a mission to demonize the His Holiness Dalai Lama. So China's Tibet policy is actually based on grasping with both hands, deepening economic development and increasing political restrictions at the same time. So the Chinese respond with a severe crackdown on the Tibetan protests in their own country, be it 2008 Beijing Olympics, self-immolations. The Chinese haven't really responded well to the protests and concerns of the Tibetans. All these developments which I've talked about are not new development. These things have been happening to Tibetans in Tibet for a very, very long time. But in my opinion, I think we need to talk more about all these developments and all these atrocities which Tibetans have been facing in their own country. But now, in CTA, in Tibetan Government in Exile, we have a new leader, Penpa Tsering, and he has been talking about reinitiating a dialogue with the Chinese leadership. So this is somewhat hinting towards the middle way approach, the crux of which is to have genuine autonomy within the Chinese control, not gaining independence. And while this has been the official policy of the Tibetan leaders in exile, unfortunately, neither is the Central Tibetan administration recognized by the Chinese, nor do they pay any heed to the middle way approach advocated by His Holiness. So there's striking variation between the ideologies of the older and younger generation of Tibetans in exile, and this is primarily because Chinese haven't really been paying any heed, as I've mentioned, to the middle way approach. So this differences in approaches among the older and the younger people, I think, is going to pose a challenge for the Tibetan movement in the long run. So this is also one of the important factors affecting the Tibetan movement. Then it is also important to consider that the CCP does not want to give away any autonomy to the Tibetans. The developments in Tibet are guided by the so-called Xi Jinping threatened socialism with the Chinese characteristic for a new era. And then what we have seen is that the Chinese grip is going to get tougher on Tibet. But in such a situation, what we have also seen is that Tibet has got international support. And some of the examples include the US and the European Union. The US Congress also approved the Tibet Policy and Support Act, supporting His Holiness to appoint his own successor. And similar support has been extended by the European Union as well. And in fact, former Prime Minister Lobsang Sangye has been engaging the international community across the Western world to gather support for Tibet. While Trump administration was quite vocal about Chinese aggression, it remains to be seen how Biden administration responds or looks at Tibet. So this support is primarily because Chinese activities in Tibet are detrimental to countries' interest as well. And if I may quote Dr. Lobsang Sangye, when he was visiting Europe, he actually said that I'm not here to seek your support for Tibet, but I'm here to warn you about the Chinese aggression. So I think this is very important for countries to keep into consideration when we talk about support for Tibet, voicing support for Tibet. But among the most affected countries is, of course, India. The Tibetan issue is not restricted to Tibet, but also concerns the countries which border Tibet and which are dependent on Tibet water. Ranade sir mentioned about the possible dam diversion projects by the CCP. So Tibet under Chinese control has several implications for India. And a prominent Tibetan scholar, the One Orbu, if I may quote him, he actually said that with Tibet under its Chinese complete domination, China now finds itself militarily and strategically more stronger, specifically with respect to India. And on the diplomatic front, it is in a favorable environment with considerable scope for diplomatic maneuvering to its advantage. So I think we really have to keep Professor Dawa Norbu's words in mind when we talk about concerns for India vis-a-vis Tibet. And then Chinese attempts to build infrastructure in Tibet and improve its connectivity with the mainland has been one of the major strategies, not only in terms of military preparedness, but also to overcome the challenges of regional disparity. China has been working on improving infrastructure and connectivity with the frontier states along its border, and the recent example is the building of the highway, including a 2-kilometer mountain tunnel in a remote part of the southern Tar, which actually ends near the border of Arunachal Pradesh. So it's a major security concern for India. The infrastructure and connectivity preparedness from the Chinese side has been a major security concern for India. But another major concern for India and the lower riparian countries is the issue of water diversion. And China has unquestionable control over the waters as Tibet is under its occupation, and India, being a lower riparian country, is highly dependent on the water of Tibet for its water security. So being a lesser of the two riparian countries, India is of course concerned about the likely fallout of Chinese activities in the long run. But despite such concerns, India hasn't really taken advantage of the presence of Tibetans in India. India doesn't want to make its people aware that Tibet is a political issue and people need to be more aware about whatever is happening in Tibet. So in essence, if China's control over Tibet is consolidated, it actually means aggression for its neighbors, especially India. Tibet is a buffer zone for India, and Tibet is important in geopolitical sense for both India and China. And I believe that for countries to have a stable relation with China, it is very important to find a solution to the issue of Tibet and extend their support to Tibet. And to conclude, I would quote Dr. Lobsang Sangye. He actually said that if the countries are not speaking for Tibet, they're also not speaking for democracy and for human rights. So I think this stands true for a lot of countries, and a lot of countries such as India, like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific countries, need to really speak up for Tibet, because it is not only detrimental for Tibet, but it's also detrimental for the interest of the countries such as India. Thank you.
How China's control over Tibet, China's colonial occupation of Tibet, how it has endangered the situation of even neighbors like India, and there are 10 riparian states, countries who are going to suffer. And there has been a discussion, and rather India, it seems what you are saying about water diversion, I think this is time to take this kind of advice from scholars like you, that these riparian states should join hands and stand up before it is too late for them. And this Tibet Policy and Support Act, which calls for a union or an association of a diplomatic association between democratic countries, I think this justifies that, and you have very well underlined that. So thank you, Sana, for this enlightenment. And now we are coming to one of our speakers who always in the limelight, who has been a great thinker and a revolutionary of the Tibetan diaspora. I am talking of Mr. Tenzin Tsundue, who has, as a Tibetan and as a thinker in both capacities, he has his own understanding of Tibetan situation, the challenges before Tibet, and the Tibetan situation, the challenges it is causing to other countries. So, Mr. Tenzin Tsundue.
On the occasion of Chinese invasion and occupation of Tibet for the past 70 years, today we are once again looking at the situation, and I'd like to present some of my opinions. And this, for me, it's an effort to make an intellectual inquiry into what had happened and how the situation is today. Firstly, I would like to look at just the very nature of invasion and occupation. What is happening in Tibet today is blatant colonization and imperialism in the darkest sense, and how it had continued up until today for 70 years without real intervention from anybody from around the world. And yet the Tibetans have never given up and continued to maintain this struggle. And therefore, even after 70 years, far from dying out, we are alive, kicking, and hopeful. Now, the nature of colonization, when China invaded Tibet, it was not just an act of colonization. It was with a diabolical intention to occupy the country, to make that country a part of China's country. And this was happening not just in Tibet, but East Turkestan and Southern Mongolia and Manchuria. And all of them put together make 60% of China's landmass today. Today, there is a revisionist perspective in China, and earlier they used to say that Tibet belongs to China, and China, occupied, and they have liberated Tibet. In fact, that was the language: peaceful liberation of Tibet from Western imperialism and feudalism. So these were the two reasons that the Chinese were giving at the time of invasion and occupation of Tibet. Today, these reasons are no more cited by China. Why? Because China has changed their narrative. Now they say that Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, and Manchuria had always been a part of China, is what the Chinese are saying today. So China has again and again refurbished their reasons to occupy Tibet. And therefore, I am saying this is not just colonization, but imperialist colonization, because China continues to think that China has a contiguous history from Sung dynasty right up to Qing dynasty. And in between, how China came under foreign occupation, firstly by the Tibetans, and then the Mongolians, Yuan dynasty, and then the Manchu dynasty, which is the Qing dynasty. And China emerged as a free and independent country only in 1911, 1912, they recreated China as a new country, Republic of China. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was their first president. And after that, the nationalists and the communists kept on fighting, and the civil war led on, continued, and then created a new country, which is People's Republic of China in 1949, when Mao Zedong came to be the new chairman or the president of China, and then from there they led the invasion of Tibet. So in all this, there's a revisionist policy that China has not only occupied land. China today is colonizing history. History of Manchuria and Mongolia and Tibet are history of China today. This is the blatant lies with which China stitched together this new country called People's Republic of China. Now, sadly, even right at the time of Chinese invasion in 1949, 1950, His Holiness the Dalai Lama at that time was 15 years old, and he wrote letters to the United States, the United Kingdom, United Nations, and India. 4 parties, His Holiness the Dalai Lama asked for help, and he did not get any help, because at the time, when the issue came up at the United Nations, at the request of India, at the behest of India, India said at the United Nations that it is better for Tibetans and Chinese to resolve the issue instead of having international intervention into this. And therefore, countries like El Salvador, Malaya, Ireland, small countries who supported Tibet and brought the issue of Tibet at the United Nations were deferred. And therefore, India at the time thought that China and India are going to be future leaders in Asia. And at that time, the government of India had this idealistic hope in the rising new communist China, that they are going to be friends. And therefore, Hindi Chini Bye-Bye started to happen. So in all these situations, when there was no way the Tibetans could deal with China or no support from outside, that was the time when the 17-point agreement was signed. And of course, it was signed not just as the Tibetans usually say, that it was signed at the gunpoint. No, it was signed with the pressure that if the Tibetans do not sign and agree to this, then there will be a full-fledged military invasion, which would result in hundreds and thousands of Tibetans being killed. And that we had already seen. There was a bitter battle in Chamdo, in eastern part of Tibet, where thousands of Tibetans died in 1950, and 1951 was the time when the 17-point agreement was signed. So this is how it worked out. So under tremendous pressure, then the Tibetan government at that time had to agree to kind of what is called the mutually beneficial arrangement, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1954 went to China to find ways of living together, but all the lies with which China stitched together the 1951 17-point agreement, all of that fell out because China did not continue respect that. For example, number 1 article in 17-point agreement said that this is the coming of Tibet back into the what is called the laps of the motherland. But there was no motherland treatment to the Tibetans. They were out there only to grab land and kill people. Any kind of resistance were thrashed, and any local authority, whether it's a district level or even the Tibetan government at that time, were undermined. And number 4 article in 17-point agreement, for example, talked about the power and status of His Holiness the Dalai Lama should be maintained as it is, but it won't. All of them were not respected. So therefore, not giving any respect to that. And then continued pressure on the Tibetan people that resulted to finally His Holiness the Dalai Lama seeking asylum in India in 1959. And right after coming into exile in 1959, in the month of April, His Holiness, the first thing he did was he repudiated the 17-point agreement and said, we will continue to fight for the independence of Tibet. So this is how the Tibetans responded. But now look at the way the West responded to it. To the West, there was idealization of rise of communism And then and much later, for example, admission of China into WTO, granting Olympics to China, all of that to mainly make this effort that the China would continue to produce cheap made in China products for the Western countries, and they would benefit from this. I've been to many other countries. I've been to 20 other countries in the West, and wherever I've gone there, I have never said I'm seeking support. I said I want the Western countries to be accountable to the benefits they have reaped out of Tibet, and that too at the cost of Tibetan people dying. 1 million, more than 1 million Tibetans have died in the process of Chinese invasion and occupation. And the Western countries, we are not seeking support. We are asking you to be accountable to the benefits you have reaped out of Tibetan people's suffering. And as if this was not enough, today when China's narrative, when China's military economic power is so powerful that it is rising and is challenging America and Europe, today the Americans are saying that there is human rights violations in East Turkestan, what is called the Xinjiang region, and also Tibet. Does it mean that America has suddenly found new love for Tibetans and Uyghur Muslims? No, they are now threatened. So today, instead of taking responsibility to their benefits or facing China, today they are under pressure, and that's why they are talking about human rights in Tibet. And also in East Turkestan. It may come to a point that tomorrow they may have to challenge China of China's occupation, real occupation of Tibet, East Turkestan, and southern Mongolia. All of that they may take up. Now look at India. We Tibetans have been telling Indians, do not be bought by China. Do not be bought by China. China विश्वासघात है. चाइना के ऊपर विश्वास मत करना. हम इतने सालों से कह रहे हैं, नहीं माना. 1962 में Chinese war हुआ था from Arunachal Pradesh. India did not listen. Indian leaders continue to say that China is going to be our friends and China will invest in India. Indian infrastructure will develop with Chinese money. But no, Galwan Valley was a bitter lesson to India, where now Indian leaders cannot say that China will continue to be our friends. That mask has been taken off. So today, for India, China has become enemy number one. What George Fernandez had earlier said, it has come in reality today. So this is the situation where we are. Now, what are the Tibetans doing? We were cheated by the Chinese in 1951 17-point agreement. We continue to ask for help. We continue to talk to the Chinese, thinking that some kind of approachment is going to work out. But even today, the Tibetan government in exile policy is to seek autonomy within People's Republic of China, as if all these 70 years of Chinese lies and brutal treatment of the Tibetans was not enough. We continue to seek autonomy, and to say that if Chinese government respects autonomy within China in Tibet, that the Tibetan government, the Tibetans are going to accept that kind of autonomy. So this is where the situation is. People are not able to speak the truth. The real truth is China is an imperialist, colonialist country. Their intention is to rule the world. Take this from me. Their intention is to rule the world. They don't care about Tibetans or Indian neighbor or civilizational friendship, as people say. No. So this is where we are today. We must face the truth. We must fight, never give up. And lastly, Tibetan people have never given up inside Tibet. Even after 70 years, Tibetans have continued to fight, and today 155 Tibetans have burned themselves in self-immolation inside Tibet. And if the result had been little more positive, there would have been terrible number of self-immolations. Tibetan people will never give up. We have never. And even to my last point, today Chinese in Tibet fear walking alone in Tibetan streets. Why? Because they fear that they may get mugged or beaten or knifed by the Tibetans. And this is the level of fear the Chinese have, even though they are majority inside Tibet. And therefore, independence is the only solution for Tibetan people, and we must continue to wage this war, no matter who is with us or not. But we will continue to fight for the independence of Tibet.
Thank you. This is exactly what we were expecting from Tenzin Tsundue. Your frank opinion about even the Central Tibetan administration on their issue of autonomy. I'm sure this is going to give a lot of food for thought to not only Tibetans but friends of Tibet also. And as you said, that Indian government has been denying the truth, the ground reality on China's behavior, and they took very long time even to start believing their own defense minister about the real intentions of China. And India is realizing today, so many, I think 2 decades after what George Fernandez had said. So thank you very much, Tenzin Sunduji, for this enlightenment and opening eyes, and especially for reassuring not only friends of Tibet, even those who are now realizing China's intentions, that Tibetan people, in spite of their position, small number, have not given up. So I think the world will learn from Tibetan people, if not from other lessons. So thank you very much, Tenzin Tsunduji. And now we come to Mr. Gompo Tundup, who is the president of Tibetan Youth Congress. As I already explained, Tibetan Youth Congress is the most, not only the largest socio-cultural political organization of Tibetan diaspora, it is also a nursery of education and training for the future, at least I would say more than 2 generations. In past years, it has been a nursery of learning from for new generations of Tibet. And Mr. Gompo Thundup, as an activist, as a well educated scholar on and experience on Tibetan situation, I will request Gompo Thundupji to please come up with your ideas on today's significance. Thank you.
Tashid Lake, and greetings to all the panelists, moderator, and the audience who is joining live. So, being as the co-organizer of this important virtual program, I want to thank all the panelists for accepting this invitation. And my special thanks to our moderator and the co-organizer of this event, VIJAY KRANTI ji, for putting all the efforts in making this virtual campaign a reality. So as you have making a kind introduction, that TYC from last 2-3 weeks, the central executive and all our regional chapters are actively engaged in different social services activities work because of the bad hit of a Chinese virus in India and Nepal. So we were very much busy with the social services activity, and we were not, I didn't get enough time to engage in this virtual work. So Vijay ji have carried, and he is the engine behind this virtual panel discussion. I'm very much thankful for the Vijay ji and all the panelists. So the previous speaker have already highlighted the important issues, especially the Tenzin Tsundue have highlighted all the history background and the way forward also. Now I'm going to give a brief history of this dark day. So on 1st October 1949, the People's Republic China was formed. And soon after, the Beijing radio have made an announcement that they are going to liberate the Tibet. Back then, the Tibetan Foreign Office have wrote to the Mao Zedong on the 2nd November 1949, which in this letter statement, our government mentioned that Tibet has from the earliest time up to now been an independent country whose political administration had never been taken away by any foreign country, and Tibet also defended her own territories from the foreign invaders. So meanwhile, the foreign offices have our foreign office letter have asked to a direct negotiation with China to return the Tibet territory annexed by the China earlier Kuomintang government. The copies of that letter was sent to the government of India, the Great Britain, and the United States. But unfortunately, back then, the PLA troops from the Southwest military have already reached the Chamdo and occupied the eastern Tibet. The Tibetan forces numbering 8,000 troops engaged with the PLA troops in a ferry battles. By 19th October 1950, the Tibetan had fought 21 battles and lost over the 5,700 brave soldiers. Since 1959, the Tibetan delegation has a continuous meeting with the Chinese counterpart. The PLA troops were directly stationed on the Tibetan soil, and they warned the representative that it is a simple telegram from the Beijing to occupy the whole Tibet with the military forces. On April 1951, then Tibetan government sent a 5-member delegation to Beijing, led by Kalun Ngabyong Ngawan Jingmila. The Tibetan government authorized all the delegation to put forward the Tibet stand, first thing, and second thing is to listen the Chinese position. In fact, it was instructed to refer all the important matter to the government in Lhasa. On 29th April 1951, the negotiation was opened with the presentation of draft proposal by the leader of Chinese delegation. Because of the proposal mentioned that Tibet was an integral part of China, the Tibetan delegation have refused to sign that agreement. After the several days of heated debate between the Tibetan delegation and the Chinese counterpart, the Tibetan delegations were addressed with a harsh treatment and insulting terms, threatened with the physical violence, and they even kept as prisoners. No further discussion was allowed to the Tibetan delegation, were cut off from preventing a contact with the government in Lhasa for the instruction. They were threatened with both the personal violence and the large-scale military retaliations against the Tibet. So the Tibetan representatives were forced to sign this agreement, and it was signed under the duress. On 23rd May, the Tibetan delegates were forced to sign what come to be known as the agreement of the Central People Government and the local government of Tibet, measure for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. Since then, Tibetan delegations were not authorized to conclude an agreement. They did not have their government seal. All they had were the seal of representative positions in the government. However, they denied having them in order to indicate their disapproval for the agreement. The Chinese then improvised a wooden seal inscripted with the names of delegation, duplicate seal forged for the purpose for the giving a necessary resemblance of the authenticity. At that time, the Tibetan delegations were warned that that they are signing agreement on their own personal capacity and no authority to be bind either His Holiness the Dalai Lama or the Tibetan government. Back then, the Prime Minister of Tibet, Lukhangwa, clearly told the Chinese representative, Chiang Jing-hu, in 1952, that Tibetan people did not accept this so-called 17-point agreement. And Tibetan opposed this agreement as less than a death warrant for the century-old of Tibet independence. Tibet has been a long strategic issue for China. So the Chinese policy makers from the late Qing dynasty onwards saw the Tibet as a backdoor for the invaders to attack the Middle Kingdom. And the communist leadership under the Mao Zedong acted on the same assumption. So with the occupation of Tibet, this is the reality that India have lost the buffer state. Not only the India, many countries in the South Asia have lost their national security because of the geographically important strategic location of Tibet. After 1959, there were several dialogues between the Tibetan government and the Chinese counterpart. Finally, in 1959, Chinese military completely occupied whole Tibet, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama were forced to leave the capital and seek refuge in India. On the way to India on 26th March 1959, His Holiness the Dalai Lama officially rejected the 17-point agreement from the Lhungze Dzong of Lhoka. From the soil of Tibet, His Holiness officially rejected the 17-point agreement. And again, he made a rejection international press briefing at Tezpur on 18th April 1959. So from 1950 onwards till date, there is a continuous resistance, continuous movement from Tibetan inside Tibet. They show the dissatisfaction of the Chinese colonialism, Chinese imperialist policy. They are not satisfied with the so-called the development of the so-called People's Republic of China. In 24th January 1989, the 10 Panchen Lama have concluded the Chinese occupation by comparing development with the destruction. Panchen Rinpoche have clearly mentioned that Tibet has lost more after the Chinese occupation than what we benefited from the People's Republic of China's development projects. Since then, there's a continuous protest from Tibetan inside Tibet, whether it be like in 1987, 88, and 89 protests, or it's a 2008 mass protest from all the three traditional regions of Tibet, and that too with the second or third generation of Tibetan people who voluntarily protest against the Chinese repressive rule. Since from 2009 till date, more than 157 non-Tibetan have self-immolated for the just cause of Tibet. In a recent year, in 2021, a young 19 years old monk from the Karze, his name is Tenzin Tsundue, he had been protests for the independence of Tibet, and he was tortured and he was beaten to death in a Chinese custody. So this is the kind of ongoing critical situation inside Tibet. Under the visionary leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Tibetan outside Tibet have been working very hard to highlight the Tibet issue on the international platform, and we are keeping our resistance movement. We are going to continuously protest and show our dissatisfaction until the independence is restored in Tibet. Since the Chinese illegal occupation of so-called People's Republic of China, there are continuous destruction of Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion, and language. The murder, torture, and arbitrary detention are widespread, and the systematic attack against the Tibetan people. More than millions of Tibetans have lost their life, and the thousands of learning institutions have been destroyed because of the Chinese occupation. Tibetan inside Tibet are denied with all the rights and freedom. They are brutally suppressed under the brutal Chinese rule. China is carrying out all its propaganda and work to trying to lure as many countries as possible with their all economic aids and all this thing. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, that there is a Chinese strategic goal to be an imperialist in this 21st century, but we need to join hand with all the countries to make China accountable for their own imperialist strategies is the first thing. And second thing is all the death and destruction that is caused by this Chinese virus and all this expansionist policy. So as Tsundue already mentioned, we the Tibetan people will never going to give up our movement until our independence is restored. And Tibet independence is a very legitimate. Tibet issue is not, as Jayadeva and the Dr. Sen has already mentioned, Tibet issue is not restricted with the Tibetan people only. It is the security in terms of environment. It is very much related with the security of Asian people, and it is very much related with the global ecosystem. So Tibet issue is an international issue. Tibet issue have to fight with the joint hand with all. So we have together, we have to make all to not to make a direct contact, to don't be fooled by the Chinese expansionist policy, whether this kind of economic aids or the any kind of political benefit. You can't be neglected, you can't be lured by the Chinese policies. So until the Tibet restore our own independence, we will keep on struggling for the independent Tibet. Tuji, thank you. Begelo. Thank you, Ji.
Thank you, Gompo Tolukji, for expressing the minds of Tibetan young generation, the way you have explained how the people of Tibet, in spite of having not even seen Dalai Lama, 2 generations after his exit from Tibet, or 3 generations after China occupied Tibet, and people have not seen either Dalai Lama or Dalai Lama's rule, still the new generations are keeping up the Tibetan flag high and suffering for that. And their determination, as you say, is going to continue. And it is for the world to realize it and understand the danger of China's designs. So thank you very much, Gompoji. And now coming to the last speaker, if I can claim to be one, I would very quickly, I do have a few points to mention. It's very shocking for an observer of Tibet like me, who has been observing Tibet for almost 50 years. It's exactly is 49 years I'm observing Tibet and China, that China has the cheek today in a civilized world to celebrate the 70th anniversary. This, I don't think, only expresses the arrogance of China. It exposes the helplessness or indifference of the civilized world also. That colonialism is celebrated in such a huge way, and a power like China feels proud of it. I read their white paper very closely. Mr. Ranade has already explained. I will only give you my impressions, personal impressions. I find it's not a white paper. It is a set of white lies. It's a whitewash of all the sins and that China has committed on Tibetan people over 70 years. Actually, when you see the whole list of subjects they are dealing with and giving explanation, any psychologist would tell you that it is China's guilt conscience which is speaking loudly on all those issues of sins, atrocities, and exploitations which they have committed over Tibetan people in last 70 years. And in last 70 years, what has happened? It was purely a colonizer, an occupying power occupying a country on given promises. They count them 1 to 17 promises, and you see that they are going back on every single promise, breaking those promises, committing genocide, looting the natural resources of that country. They are practicing racial discrimination and exploitation, destruction of religious, the lingual, religious, cultural, national identity of Tibetans, and still calling it as liberation. The way they have crushed human rights, it's a shame for all of us. I think occupation of Tibet has to be taken very seriously by its own neighbors, because the moment China occupied Tibet, the first losers were the neighboring states. I'm talking of only Tibetan occupation, because the occupation of Xinjiang has created many problems for Central Asian countries. So today is not the issue. We'll discuss it some other time. What has happened by occupation of Tibet by China, that people of India and the governments must take notice what is happening, because the China's dream of Middle Kingdom has started with dominance over Asia, which means a direct problem for Tibet, for India. When Mao, before invading Tibet, Mao had already announced that Tibet is our palm. Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Nepal are our fingers. And he said that this is how we are going to treat Asia. And unfortunately, all the countries in South Asia were sleeping. They didn't take notice of it, and today we are paying for it. And inside Tibet, what China has done, initially they tried 40 years to destroy religious identity of the people, hoping that after destroying Tibetan religion, what they will get is a patriotic Chinese. This was the formula of Mao, which failed miserably, as Gompola explained, that when people uprose in 1987, 1989, then the Chinese realized that there was a basic flaw in their policies. So it was then they changed their policy on religion. Instead of destroying religion, they started to occupy religion from within. And what we are seeing today, that they are now extended to the level that they want to have to install their own Dalai Lama. I think this is something the world has to take notice of. And I would suggest our audience to please read the white paper very seriously. It will make many things clear what China has done, where it has failed, although it says it makes claims of success. So I think it will be perhaps proper to say to conclude these discussions and shift over to question answers by one conclusion which I could make out from our friends, that Tibet is a collective challenge to the collective human conscience and human wisdom and the honesty and courage of the civilized world. If the world cannot realize it today, I think very soon it will be too late for the world to wake up or to face an aggressive China. So, thank you very much to all the speakers. It was really enlightening set of presentations, which even a person like me, having associated with Tibet for 49 years, sometimes it can give arrogance that I know everything. But today, from every speaker, I learned so many new things, and I'm sure our audience must have gained, and it must have been a very fruitful set of presentations. Now, if you permit, should we shift to the question answer session? So, because I was engaged in handling this discussion, may I request Professor Ayushi Ketkar? I'm sure you must have identified.
Yes, yes, thank you, sir. There's some
Please.
very interesting set of questions. There's some very interesting set of questions and observations that have come by, and I would request the panelists to comment on it or probably give a feedback on it. One is from Rajan Khanna, right at the beginning. He says, only sloganeering will not free Tibet. Coming together of all global democratic forces is warranted. You have Chungpo Rikselva saying, Indian government should give direct challenge to communist China. There is a very interesting observation from Nam Khansar, who says, we will never get any help from United Nations till China enjoys veto powers. And we should we should think of other methods of encircling China and freeing Tibet. So that was Nam Khansar. Then we have Tenzin Tsundue, who says proactive. We need to be more proactive, and just passive request for freeing Tibet will not be of use. He speaks of how we need to get proactive and make China responsible for its acts. He also mentions, he asks a question, how can we engage Indian population in a bigger manner, like making Tibetan history a part of Indian school curriculum? How is this possible, and how can we make it possible, rather? There is a very interesting, I think I'll stop now, then there are 3 other questions which we can take up.
Tila is a lady. Yeah, you mentioned. I'm sure cultural. No. There is nothing wrong in it. Nothing bad about it. So yes. Let us take this question of Shukila, who is asking, especially how to reach out to Indian audiences and educate Indian masses. Who would like to? Oh, let's. Tenzin Tsundue ji.
Yes. Firstly, before responding to this question, I would like to make a comment. I think so far, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was the most powerful speaker on China. Up until now, no Indian leader has spoken to a level where the Indian Prime Minister would say that China is a Vistarvad country, an expansionist country. And I would like to comment on that. I think, as much as a strong statement that is, there is a lack of understanding the diabolical nature of Chinese expansionist policy. China is not just an expansionist country. It's not just expanding the territory. The intent behind it is imperialist. China, as the word China, Zhonghua, the Chinese word Zhonghua, it says that China is the central state. Chinese people believe that they are the center of the world, and all other countries are around them. And their emperor used to be have the direct mandate of heaven. So there is the heaven, there is a Chinese emperor, and the China, Zhonghua, the central state, and rest of the world around China. So this is the basic idea of China and the Chinese people. And this is why very often China is called the Middle Kingdom. Now, when a country and the people have such idea, they always think that they have right to rule over their neighboring countries, or occupy or fight against or topple other countries. And this is exactly where they have come to. For a long time, they have been expanding economically, financially. Today, politically, they are maneuvering to control the world. And therefore, this is the statement that I wanted to make about Narendra Modi ji's statement that China is an expansionist country. Now, responding to the question, this how more and in how more effective manner can we engage Indian population in this? I think in one of our previous sessions, VIJAY KRANTI ji, I had made a suggestion, and you also responded to it. I think even in today in India, the single most weakness the Indian population find in dealing with China is information. There is very little or no information about China's occupation of Tibet, that Tibet being India's largest neighboring country, 25 lakh square kilometers of land with 4,000 kilometers of border with India. Most Indian population have no idea about it. And mainly because it was never there in the Indian school and college curriculum. हम लोग यहीं India में पढ़े हैं. We grew up in India. We studied CBSE. I've never come across any Indian textbooks that talk about it. There may be one or two. I agree with VIJAY KRANTI ji. You had earlier talked about it. But majority of Indian population have no idea about Tibet. And therefore, last year after the Galwan Valley, remember, Indian Army had to undergo a crash course on Tibetan culture, land, religion, and language. Why? This was the way Indian Army could understand the border and border people, and this is how they could respond to China. So therefore, what the Indian Army had to undergo last year as a crash course, this is something very easily a curriculum can be said in Indian school, college, university curriculum, where every Indian is taught about India's largest neighboring country, Tibet, sharing a longest border.
Yes, thank you. Anybody would like to comment on it? Any of our panelists? Yeah. So, yeah, Mr. Ranade and then Sana.
I'd just like to make two short points, basically adding to what Tenzin Tsundue said. The first is, while bringing Tibet into the school textbooks, etc., would take time. After all, there is a process. The recommendation has to be approved, then it has to come into the textbook and then printed. So that's a long drawn out thing. We should pursue it, but that's a long drawn out thing. But in the meantime, I feel that there are two ways in which to mobilize or to mobilize Indian opinion or to get the Indian people to support the cause of Tibet. The first is to go to the universities and schools, colleges and schools, and talk to them. I think this needs to be done in a sustained manner. The second is through films. Making a film today is not very difficult, particularly if we are putting it out over mobiles and YouTube, etc. So I think these two things need to be done. And the Tibetans must use their strongest soft power, which is the Dalai Lama. He today, if he goes anywhere, if he makes a speech, people will throng to listen. And this needs to be done with opinion makers, with the business lobby, the important business lobby, and with students. I think, a couple of addresses a year in these settings would go a long way in doing two things. mobilizing Indian public opinion in favor of Tibet and Tibetans, and secondly, making them aware of what China is up to. Thank you.
Now, Sana, please.
I think Indians are pretty aware about Tibetans, and as Ranade said, it's primarily because of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So I think Tibet has been covered by a lot of news channels, regional English, Hindi, and other news channels as well, and it's primarily because of Dalai Lama. And also I have done a project with the CTA, and VIJAY KRANTI sir knows about it. He was a part of the committee. So we researched on the perception of Indians of Tibet and Tibetans, and how could we strengthen the relationship between Indians and Tibetans in India. I can't disclose the result, but there were efforts which were put out by the CTA, but I don't see those many efforts anymore. There might be some efforts and projects, but I think it should be led by the CTA. And also, if I may talk about the scholarship on Tibet in India, it's when we talk about Tibet, our scholarship is so China-centric. So I worked with CAPS, and Ranade sir was also with CAPS. So my reference was actually Ranade sir's articles. Apart from him, I really don't see a lot of people writing on Tibet consistently. So I think this is also one of the problems when we talk about awareing more and more Indians about Tibet. And also, I think what we can do is we can have conferences with Indian scholars and Tibetan scholars. But what I generally see is that if a conference is being organized by a Tibetan office or a think tank, they only invite Tibetan scholars. I know that there's a need to promote and endorse Tibetan scholars, but I believe that we need to have more and more collaborations. And today's webinar is one example of such collaborations. We have Tibetan scholars as well as we have Indian scholars. So I believe we need to interact more to make people aware about it. And also people like us need to be more aware about Tibet, because as I said, our scholarship is so China-centric that we just lose touch with Tibet. And to end this comment, I want to say that when we compare Taiwan and Tibet in India, I think more people are more aware about Tibet than actually Taiwan. So I think that's a positive development, and that's a win.
Thank you, Sana, for giving this insight. And I would also love to underline what Mr. Ranade said, that the role His Holiness Dalai Lama himself personally can play is enormous, and it has been, I won't say underutilized, it has been not utilized by the Tibetan people or His Holiness himself. He can, if I have the the freedom to say so, because when 156 Tibetans commit self-immolation, I think there should have been some action at the highest level from Tibetans, which would have attracted the whole world. I was shocked to see that one person from Tunisia commits self-immolation, and there is uprising in 12 countries. The whole world is supporting those countries and stands by that self-immolator. But we didn't see one country, one parliament, one individual leader standing up forcefully in support of 156 self-immolations. I wish, a person like Dalai Lama ji himself would have taken some action like Gandhiji used to do, going on fast or standing up personally on such issues. I think that would make enormous difference. And I agree with Ranadeji's 100% that this is time His Holiness the Dalai Lama has to play a very strong political role also in Tibetan freedom movement. I won't say more than that. Ayushi, do you have some more questions? Ms. Kai Mueller wants to say. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I just wanted to relate to something that has been said just now with regard to information. And I think if I look at Tibet from a European public perspective, it is very striking that despite all the negative developments we've been talking about just now over well, the past decades, specifically since Xi Jinping has been at the helm. It is quite striking that despite these negative developments, the urgency of the issue of Tibet has rather diminished in the public eye here in Europe, and that's got to do very much a lot with the lack of information, the lack of access to Tibet for Western journalists, correspondents, diplomats, NGOs, parliamentarians, and so forth. And I think it needs to be really high on the agenda for anyone who wants to achieve change. That this is somewhat being broken up. This lockdown of Tibet for the outside world. This needs to be subject of sanctions. Perhaps we're talking about sanctions vis-a-vis Xinjiang, East Turkestan, from the European Union with regard to those terrible human rights violations they have there. But it should also be on the agenda to open up Tibet again, because whatever one tries to achieve in terms of political change in Tibet, at the beginning there is information, and we need this information about incidents, about policies, about developments with concrete examples. We need that kind of information to bring policymakers, lawmakers, stakeholders here in Europe and beyond to feel the urgency for change and the urgency to address the Tibet conflict with the Chinese government with real consequences. It is not enough. I think it's really important for international politics to understand, to just address the issues, the problems in Tibet. It's not enough anymore. And we and others, and I think it should be clear, there need to be consequences for the Chinese government, for the CCP, for their policies, one of which needs to be sanctions for this lockdown on information, because information is the beginning of everything. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. The issue you raised about lockdown on information, and what I would add another adjective to that is gatekeeping of information in the West has become a serious issue. Even the news agencies of Western countries, newspapers of Western countries, they are knowingly or inadvertently playing the game of China. The way they rent out their full pages to Chinese editorials, the way TVs play propaganda films of Chinese government as snippets or as some exclusive stories, that is very sad. And Chinese journalists, I've been raising this issue with the government of India, that why India should permit such a huge baraat of Chinese journalists in India right up to Srinagar, whereas Indian newspapers, the total number of journalists from India is less than the fingers of my hand. Only PTI, UNI, Hindu, Times of India, and one DD News. That's all. India should do it reciprocally. Anyhow, this is one issue which we have a challenge. Is there any next question, please, Ayushi?
Yes, sir. The last set of questions, first is by Ved Prakash Mishra ji. He says, even after the Ladakh incursions, India has an ad hoc approach. We should go back for the pre-1947 border resolution. That's his observation, and he's seeking comments on that. Then you have Celeste, who is asking, various governments have been quiet for decades. It's only after the Uyghur issue that Tibet is also gaining currency. Tenzin Tsundue again states that 2 prime ministers of India had supported the Tibetan government in exile by recognizing it. It was Lal Bahadur Shastri and Rajiv Gandhi, but unfortunately that didn't come through, and that was not a public, the state policy, and that is been a bane for Tibet. Tibet has not got the kind of support that it should get from India. We have Tenzin Tsundue saying, what do you think is a solution to the Tibet issue now? Do you think complete independence is a possibility, or they'll have to settle for a middle path, something like autonomy, that kind of a thing? Then you've got Jamyang Tibet stating, he quotes the Wall Street. He says, according to the Wall Street, dealing with CCP is only possible through stick and strength. So he says there's no other way of dealing with the Communist Party of China, then that's the only way. And perhaps we can have our panelists comment on it. And last but not the least, there's a specific question to Ranade sir. We have Tenzin who quotes his article. His article would say, titled "China exposes its duplicity. No prospect for peace in Ladakh." He wants your comments further on that. He says, this is an article by Jayadeva Ranade ji. Could you please elaborate on this briefly? That's what he wants. So I think this is the last set of questions we can have.
Okay.
Would you like me to respond? So, with reference to the last question, I thought my article should have made it clear, but let me put it in the context of today. We are seeing the talks between the army commanders at the border drag on. I don't see any resolution coming along, particularly because the Chinese have made formal statements laying their claim on the whole of Ladakh. Secondly, they have announced plans prior to the confrontation in May for making the Pangong Lake area, and here I say, quote, an international tourist spot, unquote. Having said that, having begun the preparatory work for making it an international tourist spot, obviously their intention is to stay in that area permanently. Third is that Chinese propaganda teams and public security teams have been traveling to the border areas like Chushul and Ali, explaining to the people the alignment, so-called alignment of where the border is. That's one part of it. The second, I think any intelligent person would ask the question, why the Chinese massed 60,000 troops along the border? It's not a small number, it's a huge number. It requires a lot of expense, a lot of coordination, a lot of movement of troops from the rear areas to the forward areas. Why should any country do that unless it has a particular objective where these forces are going to be utilized? I think the fact that we mobilized in record time to block them, we should have been there up front even earlier, but we blocked them, has frustrated their plans. But obviously there is a larger agenda in mind, which the Chinese are waiting for. They haven't, mind you, pulled back. They have in fact called in more troops now, and they have begun arming the troops which are there with even more modern weapons. These are not comfortable signs. These are signs that tension is here to stay. At the very least, the Chinese are keeping the pressure on us in a relentless fashion. And if not the very least, the next is they are planning to make a surprise move somewhere in order to grab territories that they covet. So this is why I made that statement, and I still stand by it. I want to make two quick comments on some other questions that were made. One was about the middle path. The election of Penpa Tsering, who subscribes to the middle path, was commented upon by the Chinese, and their Chu Wai-chun, who has been in the United Front Department dealing with the Tibetans, he said that the middle path is nothing but a disguised method of Tibet claiming total independence in the final analysis. Secondly, as far as the border is concerned, someone said we should go back to 1949 or whatever. Border issues can be settled only by both the concerned parties. It takes two to tango. One person, unless he's supremely powerful, cannot dictate the border. China has tried it in the past. It has not succeeded. There will have to be a negotiation, if at all. So that's the comment that I make. And finally, it's interesting to hear the comment of comparing the Xinjiang situation with the Tibet situation and saying that because Xinjiang has come to the fore now, the Tibet issue is also coming up. I differ quite strongly with that. In fact, the Tibet issue has dominated international headlines, and the Xinjiang issue is only now coming. And the Uyghurs have been complaining, me privately, certainly they've been doing it elsewhere, that if they had a figure like the Dalai Lama, their issue would have also got global attention. So I don't agree with that statement. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think now we have time for one question, isn't it? Or if you don't have questions, is it time to conclude? Ayushi, do you have any question?
There are some, sir. There's one by Nawam who says, though the East Turkestan issue is more out there in the open, despite Tibet being an older issue, why is that? So that's one. And then there are questions that are they are coming in.
Okay. But that question has been answered, I think.
Yes, that has been answered. So I think that has been taken care of.
So maybe I think let me use my privileges to conclude. I'm sure there will be never end of questions when such thought-provoking talks have been presented. There will be endless chain of questions. So I will request now Ayushi to please give vote of thanks, and then we will conclude.
Thank you, sir. It's really been a privilege. This talk has been absolutely enlightening. And on behalf of the Center for Himalayan Studies and Engagement, CHASE, and Tibetan Youth Congress, the two organizers of this event, I would like to thank all the speakers. It's been a stellar panel, and bringing them all together is an achievement by itself. And the kind of discussion we've had, it's absolutely been exemplary. And I'm sure everyone has benefited from it. I would like to thank the speakers for removing time from their extremely busy schedule. We've got a senior bureaucrat here, Jayadeva Ranade sir, who's with us. We've got Kai Müller from Germany. Despite his international campaigns on Tibet, he's found the time to be with us today. We've got a very young scholar, Sana Hashmi, our very own Indian scholar based out of Taiwan, who's been with us today, and we hope to see you more in future as well, Sana. And of course, our social media celebrity, Tenzin Tsundue, whom we see more doing campaigns and including his recent march in support of Tibet. So thank you all for finding time. And of course, my special thanks to Vangpola. He's not only been a panelist, but also the co-organizer of this event. Hope to collaborate with you on many such events, because I think raising the Tibet issue is not just the need of the hour, but it is something which is possible now. The possibilities of an independent Tibet has become even more bright with COVID, post-COVID issue, and the world realizing that China is not just an aggressive power, but it is an imperialistic power. It's a colonial power which wants its borders spreading more than Asia itself. It wants a global reach. So the issues, I wouldn't want to say, but we all know, and as the panelists have beautifully brought out, right from the origin of China to the occupation of Tibet itself, and till the most recent, the 41-page white paper, which China has produced hardly 2 days ago. It shows very clearly how China, in its entire journey, has not only colonized Tibet and various parts. Probably this is a part, as I teach international relations, we say how Mao had this 5-finger plan, and not just what VIJAY KRANTI ji mentioned, but today we see Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Mongolia, and of course Tibet, which is at the heart of their entire Tianxia system, their grand strategy. So we see this entire edifice and all the issues that are brought about, right from the exploitation of resources. So Tibet issue, very rightly, as it's very rightly said, is not just an issue of an independent country and its people. It's a global issue. It's an environmental issue. It's a climate change issue. It's one of exploitation of resources. It's a human rights issue. So this has various ramifications. And as the panelists have beautifully brought out every aspect of it, right from human genocide, cultural genocide, exploitation of resources, the entire spectrum has been brought out so beautifully. I can't thank the panelists enough. And above all, the participants who have joined in from various parts of the globe to be with us today, to stand in solidarity on the Tibet issue, and the India-Tibet relationship, and how this should be furthered in the interest not only of Tibet but of the world itself, in halting China's march and its malicious designs on in various aspects, whether it's biowarfare or curbing indigenous people, their rights to self-determination, human rights. So it's been wonderful. It's been a pleasure, and I'll fail in my duties if I not thank VIJAY KRANTI ji for making this all happen. He has been one person who has stood by Dalai Lama ji and His Holiness and the cause of Tibet for more than half his life, perhaps, or his entire professional career. He's been a scholar on Tibet when probably Tibet was not even studied or not thought an important aspect of India's foreign policy. It's high time we, as mentioned even in the question hour session, we move from an ad hoc policy on Tibet and come up with something more substantial, more concrete, both in the interest of India and Tibet. And this, if it happens in the lifetime of His Holiness, will be all the more better. I think that will be the best tribute we can give to him and our friendship between both the countries. Thank you so much, everybody, for being there. And we look forward to your participation as we'll continue with the Tibet series in the days to come as well. I think this is an important issue and it needs to reach its logical conclusion. Thank you so much for being here.
And I will be failing in my duty if I don't express thanks to two special persons. One is Tenzin Tsundue, a young expert on cyber issues, who has been handling this entire webinar, and who has been helping us in linking, creating those links. And he is one of those young people who are emerging as the cyber army of Tibet. So thank you very much, Tenzin Tsundue ji, for all your support, and Anjali Mishra, our young colleague, a young member of Chase, who is a young journalist, budding journalist, for handling media issues of it. So once again, thank you, everybody. And I wish all of you good health and the best of well-being for all the people you love. Please take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.